All right, guys. It's March 22nd. I'm doing a sit rep on the ongoing war in Gaza, Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, etc. Um, Probably gonna go to this weekly format. Maybe I'll try to do shorter ones than I used to during the 470 days, and probably once a week. Probably it'll be Saturday nights, and then you can pick them up anytime on Saturday night or Sunday morning. So last week, I said I thought that the war was back on. This week, the war is back on. So Israel began the week by intense bombing, killing hundreds, I think 700 people. They killed in bombings of tents, people in tents, people gathering in their destroyed homes. And the US continued to bomb Yemen. The Ansarallah in Yemen responded. They attacked the US Navy with missiles, forcing the US Navy to move to a more distant outpost. They have resumed their blockade. And as of yesterday, I believe, Ansarallah also announced an aerial blockade of Tel Aviv's airport, Ben Gurion Airport in so-called Tel Aviv. So they said they announced, particularly to all the airlines that fly in and out of Tel Aviv, that they should consider Ben Gurion Airport to no longer be safe. So they hit the airport and they've announced that they intend to continue hitting the airport. So America is bombing Yemen. Yemen is bombing Israel. Yemen is bombing the US Navy. Israel is bombing Gaza. Israel is also bombing Lebanon. They claimed that Hezbollah attacked Metula settlement in northern Israel and then began bombing Lebanon again. So Hezbollah said we weren't, it wasn't us. But nonetheless, the Israelis are bombing Lebanon too. So presumably if they announced that Hezbollah was attacking them, it's because they want to resume a bombing campaign of Lebanon as well. Trump has also threatened Iran. He said, we hold Iran responsible for what Ansarallah is doing, which I'm not sure what the point of that is. Obviously, or the most obvious explanation is that he's intends to start a World War III with Iran, which maybe he does. So that's the situation, I guess. In brief, the war has escalated quite a bit since I talked to you last. So there's a couple of points that I want to make to try to make sense of this. As usual with these sit reps, I'm trying to make sense of the strategies of the different belligerents. So why did the Israelis decide to blow up the ceasefire, start attacking the population of Gaza again? They've moved troops somewhat into the buffer zone and into the areas that they had designated as their corridors. So they've never left the border with Rafah, the so-called Philadelphia corridor. Apparently, they're back into the Netzarim corridor and the buffer zone in North Gaza. So ground troops are back, bombing is back. And why did they do that? What I said last week was I think they've forgotten the ineffectiveness of their army when faced with the resistance in Gaza. I think they've want to see whether they can win using the same methods that didn't win them the war in the previous round. They want to see whether there's some exhaustion effect that they can take advantage of, even though the exhaustion is on their side as well. They want to see whether they can starve Gaza into submission, whether they can succeed with extermination. They just want to try this and trying it during a ceasefire. They had a 60-day ceasefire, and they were gathering intelligence to try to assassinate people later. They were keeping in the corridor that they said they were going to withdraw from, the Philadelphia corridor. They were antagonizing and occupying more land in Lebanon during the ceasefire. They were occupying more land in Syria during their unopposed, because they're basically a Western Turkish proxy controls Syria now, which is not fighting them. Rather, it's coordinating with them. It's working with them. HTS, the so-called HTS of Jolani, so-called Jolani, or whatever his name is now. So they've forgotten what it was like to be at war, and they think war is just dominating and taking whatever they want. And this week, now Ansarallah said, we're going to resume the blockade. Then they announced that they were resuming the blockade. The Americans decided to hit them first. But now Ansarallah has been hitting Israel with missiles, and the Israelis are back to going to shelters every other day. Resistance in Gaza has hit Israelis with rockets, and the Israelis are going back to shelters every other day because of that. And as they force Hezbollah to fight, they will also find themselves to be under fire from that quarter as well. Hezbollah wants the ceasefire. They have domestic problems. Their leadership and arsenal was severely depleted. They have to worry about an attack from Syria now. So they're not keen, they're not chomping to go back to war with Israel. But if Israel forces them, if the choice is surrender or fight, they're going to fight. And Israel will have forgotten about that as well. But they will remember when the fighting starts again, and they will not like what they remember. And um, that is what's going to happen on their side. I think a big part of why they sought the ceasefires that they sought had to do with the exhaustion of their military. Their military has been either resting or unopposed for 60 days. That's not long enough to make a weak and ineffective military ground force effective, but it is long enough to forget that you're ineffective, I believe. So I think that's the main logic on the Israeli side. Now, this is something that I want to tell people about the way that I think about this problem compared to some of the other analyses you might see, even from friendlies. People will analyze Trump and the swamp and the deep state in America and how Trump has to do this and that because of the lobby, but he doesn't really want to. Um, to put it very plainly, think Trump is Zionist scum like any other um, US president in history, in post World War II history, I guess. So I don't really I don't really think about this issue that way. The point of this channel is military analysis. This is a military question. This is about what America and Israel can get away with and what they can get away with because of resources, because of military capacities of that they have and that their opponents have. What they can get away with is what they're going to do. And what they're constrained by is military resistance to their projects, to their plans, and military capabilities arrayed against them. So I think it's a waste of time and energy to look too deeply into and read tea leaves and do White Houseology on what Trump is really, really, really thinking. The same goes for all parties in all the Western countries. And the same goes for Israel. So Israel, you'll hear a lot of analysis about Trump. What's the guy? Netanyahu's many different domestic political crises. He's in a crisis with the court right now. He's trying to fire this guy. The guy is not going. He may not have the right to fire him. blah, blah, blah. And the reason I'm so dismissive of this because the next person after Netanyahu in line is also a genocidal racist. The one after that is a genocidal racist, and there are millions of them, millions, not hundreds, not hundreds of thousands, millions of genocidal racists ready to take the reins and resume what they are limited by is their supply of soldiers who are willing to die for this. What they're limited by is the vehicles, the armor, the bombs, the missiles, the fuel, the food, the business climate, the finance, the actual resources and capabilities that they have to bear, and those that are arrayed against them. That is the equation that they're looking at, and that is what is going to determine this, not domestic disputes between genocidal racists in Israel or genocidal racists elsewhere in the West. So, what, how is this going to go from here? Like, when it ended after 470 days, I said, I said, if it resumes again, and I didn't discount that it was going to resume again because we know who we're dealing with here. But if it resumes again, it'll very likely be even shorter than it was before because it's going to resume before Israel has remedied the weaknesses in its military capacity that it has. It just this is going to take years to address. Not you they're not going to be able to address it during this war. And from my perspective, we are in the same war that we were in since October 7th, 2023. There was a pause in November 2023, and there was a 60-day pause that just ended last week. And that is not enough time to rebuild. And it's also not enough time for Hezbollah to rebuild, which is why Hezbollah is not keen to go back to war. Ansarallah has been bombed continuously since 2015 by Western planes and Western bombs. That in theory, it was from Saudi Arabia. Part of it is occupied still. There's a Western sponsored government in waiting. And Ansarallah has been under attack continuously since that time. And they have, under those conditions, managed to build a military capacity that can challenge the American Navy in the Red Sea and that can hit Israel with missiles and drones. And that is new. Every other war that Gaza has faced against Israel since 2005, so the 2008-9, which was a big one, 2012, which was relatively smaller, 2014, which was relatively bigger, 2018, which was that nonviolent March of Return, 2021, all of those wars were fought and and the Gaza resistance did quite well against the Israelis when the Israelis invaded Gaza. October 7th, the Gaza resistance attacked outside of Gaza into so-called Israel. But that was very limited. That was a raid, and they returned inside Gaza, and the Israelis attacked them inside Gaza and showed that they can't really defeat them inside Gaza. But if Israel decides to starve Gaza, if Israel decides to blockade Gaza, then Gaza never had an answer. But this war, this time, post 2023, Yemen has stepped into this and said there's no free blockade for Israel. Israel blockades Gaza, then Yemen blockades Israel. They blockade the Red Sea, and now they're blockading the airport as well. And so there's no comfortable forget about forget about the fact that we're starving Gaza to death. For Israel, Israel is going to, everybody in Israel is going to know, and they're not just going to know from these little rockets, relatively little rockets. I'm not being dismissive of what the Gaza resistance is doing, but it's not that kind of reminder. It's a reminder of a solid fuel ballistic missile that reaches hypersonic speeds and is probably impossible to intercept with Israel's current technologies. So Israel naturally turns to the United States and says, shut these people down, which the Americans also cannot seem to do. So Gaza is this site of the worst atrocities that we've ever seen, that Israel is reveling in, and transforming itself into a society the likes of which humanity has rarely seen, um, in terms of moral corruption and bankruptcy and support for genocide. And they're transforming the whole West. It's all transforming before our eyes, as I've been chronicling and watching here. And Gaza is also the site of a kind of an anvil that Israel pounds and pounds and cannot defeat militarily, cannot impose its will on. And so there's this anvil, and Yemen now can strike Israel from afar with this in this standoff fashion and make it impossible for Israel to silently choke Gaza to death. And Yemen, it turns out, is also extremely hardy, extremely difficult to impose a final defeat on or impose their will on. So the strategy of the resistance now, it only comes down to Yemen and Gaza. Hezbollah is out, Syria has fallen, Iran is preoccupied with whatever issues it is having domestically. The multipolars, China, Russia, the countries that are trying to build a new world order are also nowhere to be seen. You may have seen a very what's the word? I don't know. It's an interview with the Chinese ambassador to Israel that was just remarkable in its avoidance of the fact that Israel is actively committing genocide right now. And so if that's the Chinese position, and the Russian position, if Russia had that Putin Trump call and Putin did in fact say or agree that Iran should never be allowed to threaten Israel, which, I didn't find that hard to believe the way that it wasn't in the Russian readout, but I don't find that all that hard to believe that Putin would say that a lot of Russians are very supportive of Israel. A lot of Israelis are Russian. I've been saying this for a while. There are millions of Israelis who are Russian. Israel's the people are, Germans, Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, Romanians, people from that part of the world. Most of the people that are Israeli Jews that are doing all of these crimes are from that part of the world. Then there are people from the Arab, Jewish people from the Arab parts of the world that have become Israelis. And some others, Americans, Western, French and people from other places. But the big part of the population is East European, and probably the biggest group is Russian. And they go back and forth, and they, have business interests in both places. And so there, there's a Zionism, and the Israeli lobby are also powerful in Russia. So it's come down to to Yemen and Gaza. And Gaza forced the ceasefire on Israel after everyone else was out, except again Yemen. And now Yemen and Israel are fighting America and Israel. I mean, Yemen and Gaza are fighting Israel and America. And I don't know. I don't know how it's going to go. The permissiveness. You may have seen some tweets from Amal Saad, but the permissiveness of genocide, the permissiveness that we see now of the world order, it's become very clear that there will be no consequences for Israel, not in any international forum, not in any legal sense, not in the Security Council. There will be no consequences for Israel. There will be no consequences for Israelis. There will be consequences for people who have something critical to say about Israel, who have something to say in support of Palestine. Those are the people who will be suffering in the world order in the years to come. So where we are now is the only deterrence imaginable right now for total genocide is from these very small, very heavily destroyed two countries that are, Yemen doesn't have full control over all of Yemen, and the Gaza has been partially occupied by the Israelis and totally destroyed by the Israelis. And they've killed hundreds of thousands of people, and they're killing them at a constant rate now, and they're also trying to starve them. And for all of that, I don't see a clear path to victory for Israel and America either, even in spite of all of that. So it could very well be the way that the resistance is talking is, we're going to fight you, and we expect you to return to an actual ceasefire with conditions that we can accept, which is an end to the aggression, return of the prisoners, the Palestinian prisoners for the Israeli prisoners, rebuilding aid, etc. So I think the most likely scenario is that at some point we're going to return to a ceasefire, but I don't think that's going to be the end. I think there's going to be I I think this war that started with October 2023 may have more pauses, but it seems to me to be the Israeli agenda, the American agenda, the composition and ideology of Israel, the objectives that America has in the region are unattainable. The objectives that Israel has in the region are unattainable and frankly insane. And that means that the situation is unstable, and it can only stabilize through war. And so, where is it going to stabilize? How is it going to stabilize? It may end up stabilizing with Israel as with Zionism ultimately failing as an ideology. It's hard to imagine. You've heard people say this: either the world will end Zionism, or Zionism will end the world. And it does seem to be getting to that point, or already there, where it's just Zionists are going to keep going. And if they just if they're just, I mean, you may have seen the statements from people like Katz and Netanyahu have been more genocidal than the ones that brought Yoav Gallant and Netanyahu to the ICC for what that was worth, or the ICJ for what that was worth. But the statements that Katz said was like, if we're gonna commit genocide, and if you spontaneously surrender, possibilities open up for you like resettlement in other parts of the world. I mean, those are very clearly criminal statements, except that the international law is an absolute joke. So we can say we're pretty safe to assume that nothing is going to happen to any of these people as a result of making such statements. But I said in 2023, don't assume that it would be over if they managed to displace the people of Gaza into the Sinai. They're not going to displace the people of Gaza into the Sinai without occupying the location. Israel doesn't want to get rid of the Palestinians. Israel wants to control the Palestinians wherever they are. Israel's obsessed. Zionists are obsessed with Palestinians. You can be a Palestinian on a campus somewhere in North America or Europe. The Zionists will find you there. They are obsessed with you. They're obsessed with Palestinians. So they don't want to expel them to Sinai, or if they do, if they expel them to the Sinai, they're going to go and follow them and occupy them in the Sinai. They're never going to leave them alone. So it's not over, and there will be resistance in Sinai. And even though Hezbollah wants to have a ceasefire right now, Israel could drive them back to fighting them and reactivating their missile force and firing more missiles into more strategic locations inside Israel. And HTS is in a very unstable situation. They've got themselves into a very unstable situation. They're trying to commit genocide against minorities in Syria to stabilize their situation. That's not going to stabilize their situation. So it is an extremely unstable situation, and the war is going to continue because of it. And there are more extreme things that the Israelis and the Americans can do. There are. But there are also more extreme things that Yemen can do in reply. And, I don't really feel like talking about that right now. I'm sure you can imagine them, and so can I. But these are all thinkable things in this moment. Um, I I think the thing to watch in the coming week until I see you next, I would say watch Israel and watch their will to fight, because like I said, I think a big part of their return to war has to do with the short memory of the misery of continually living in and out of air raid shelters, and the idea that what Israel really wants, what Israelis really want, is to starve Gaza with no consequence to themselves. And that when that becomes impossible, they will go back to looking for alternatives, and alternatives that didn't seem acceptable, like the ceasefire, become acceptable when the circumstances change. The circumstances that forced them to a ceasefire included the exhaustion of their army and the exhaustion of people with the lack of normalcy. And when things returned to a bit of normalcy and their army got a bit of rest, they thought, hey, this is nice, but it would be nicer to have this and continue the genocide. So they picked up the genocide again, and now they're back to that misery again. So we'll have to see. But if the situation that led to the ceasefire resumes, we will be heading back towards a ceasefire. And you could think of ceasefires as breaks in the war, or you could think of bouts of war, as breaks between ceasefires. And either way, we'll have to continue to monitor them. And I will be here. Hang in there. And we'll see you in the next one.